So thank you all for attending this IISS discussion meeting on assessing the nuclear negotiations with Iran. It's disappointing, but not terribly surprising, that we are here today to not to celebrate and analyze a comprehensive agreement to resolve the long-standing Iranian nuclear issue. We're here rather to talk about the what-ifs, what went wrong, what are the economic, political, and strategic implications, and what may be possible in the coming months. As Secretary of State for Foreign and Commonwealth Affairs Philip Hammond said in Parliament earlier this week, at the heart of the negotiations is the need to reconcile Iran's aspirations for a peaceful nuclear program with our insistence on ensuring Iran cannot develop a nuclear weapons capability. The parties were, no, that was his quote, back to me. The parties were unable to reach agreement, in my view, because Iran seeks to maintain and expand, eventually, enrichment capabilities that exceed its practical needs, which was the principle agreed in the November 2013 Joint Plan of Action. For at least the next decade into the future, Iran will not have a practical need for an industrial scale enrichment program, because Russia is committed to providing the fuel for the current Bushehr reactor for its lifetime and for additional reactors that it recently agreed to provide to Iran. The contract for the first reactor runs out in 2021, but Russia had committed in a protocol agreement with Iran to provide fuel for the lifetime. So Iran has put forward various reasons why it needs an enrichment capability, reasons that include national pride in their technological achievements and a desire for self-efficiency. The self-efficiency argument doesn't quite work because of Iran's limited uranium ore. They would be dependent on foreign supplies in any case. So, to my analysis, the most logical explanation is a hedging strategy. As I see it, Iran wants to maintain a potential path to a nuclear weapon should it decide in the future it needs this option. And the six powers that are negotiating with Iran are determined to block all such paths. Disagreement on the scope and pace of sanctions was a second insurmountable obstacle in the talks that have been taking place the last year. I'm pretty sure Iran understood that President Obama does not have the authority to remove all sanctions that are imposed by the U.S. Congress, and that the U.S. Congress is not disposed itself to removing these sanctions. To the contrary, they seem inclined to add sanctions, which contributes to the difficulty. President Obama and his fellow parties to the let's call them the E3+3, because we're in Europe, they do have the authority to remove the UN sanctions, but they all had agreed not to do that up front in any deal, but rather to have it staged as a way to ensure compliance with any deal, which in the end was not made. So what we have instead of a deal is the capping and extension, continued extension of Iran's enrichment and other sensitive nuclear programs, and a continued capping of sanctions and a continued unfreezing of a certain amount of Iran's frozen oil revenues. I think all panelists would agree that this extension of the deal, this capping of both enrichment and sanctions, is better than a return to the status quo ante of an escalation of both sanctions and centrifuges and the confrontation and crisis that would ensue under that circumstance. Our panel features three expatriate Iranians who have been discussing these issues together for the past year under the auspices of a group they formed called the European Iran Research Group. Leading off the panel will be Belfer Center Associate Ariane Tabatabai, who is also a columnist for the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists. In her Bulletin article, she most recently talked about religious aspects in Iran, which I thought was quite interesting. But today she's going to focus on the nuclear aspects. Next will be the director of the European Iran Research Group, Roosevelt Parsi, who is now a senior lecturer at the Department of Human Rights Studies at Lund University in Sweden, from which he just came this morning. He's going to cover the domestic political environment in Iran. And then Ali Gizelbash, an independent strategic consultant and former Statoil executive, will address economic issues. So I've asked each of the panelists to speak for about 10 minutes, which will allow us ample time at the end to have a good discussion. Ariane, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mark. Let me start by thanking IISS, Mark and Dina for putting this together. Of course, I think we were all hoping to be here today and talk about a comprehensive deal, but as Mark mentioned, we have an extension of the interim deal for another 7 months. The plan for now is to have some sort of political agreements by March of next year and to have a comprehensive deal by the end of June. In the meantime, though, the JPOA, the Joint Plan of Action or the interim deal, will be implemented by all parties, which is, as Mark mentioned, fairly good news. This means that Iran will continue to suspend some of its sensitive activities in exchange for some sanctions relief. In the next few months, Iran will continue to convert some of its 20% oxide into reactor fuel, which is a positive thing. But the 3 sticking points that we had in the past few months will continue to persist. The first one is sanctions relief, which I will leave to Ali to discuss. Second is the time frame of the deal. How long will the deal be implemented for? The P5+1 wants something closer to 15 to 20 years, while Iran started off by saying we want less than 10 years. In the end, ultimately, I think that it will fall between 10 to 15 years in order for the IAEA to be able to verify that Iran is in full compliance with its obligations and to remove any suspicions of non-peaceful uses of the nuclear program. And lastly, the issue of enrichment, which has been perhaps the most important thing that the parties have discussed. It's been the most high profile in Iran, certainly, and also in the United States and in the UK. The parties started very, very far from each other. The P5+1 wanted Iran to go down to about 1,500 centrifuges. It currently has nearly 20,000, about half of which are operating, so about 9,400 are operating. Iran started off by saying we're not going to cut down any centrifuges. As the interim deal was implemented, the parties started saying that they were getting closer to the P5+1, wanting Iran to cut back to about 4,500, while the Iranians are stuck at around 7,500 centrifuges. I think that on this front, Iran still has some work to do, and it can go down another 2,000 centrifuges or so, falling at a number between 4,000 to 5,000 centrifuges, which would be ideal for both parties to sell back home domestically. But that also depends on 2 other factors. The issue of enrichment will be, or is, inherently interlinked with the issue of the time frame, which I mentioned, and also the issue of the LEU stockpiles that Iran currently has, and that it would be shipping off to Russia. So, depending on how they manage to agree on the time frame, the length of the deal, and the LEU stockpile issue, I think that there will be more room for the parties to maneuver and address the issue of the number of centrifuges. The positive developments in the past couple of weeks has been that Russia has made an agreement with Iran to sell 2 reactors to Iran in the next few years. Iran's plans, stated plans, are to have about 8 more reactors on its soil. And it wants to have a desalination plant next to each one of these to address its water shortage issues. Russia is, of course, going to be a key partner for Iran, and it has already agreed. The head of the Iranian Atomic Energy Organization, Ali Akbar Salehi, went to Russia a couple of weeks ago, and they made this agreement. The great thing about this agreement is that not only will Russia provide the reactors, but it will also do a full service of it, meaning that it will provide Iran with the enriched uranium. It will make certain parts of the fuel rods in Iran in cooperation with Iranians. And then the spent fuel will be shipped back to Russia, which means that, first of all, Iran will have less of a need for domestic enrichment, which, as Mark mentioned already, it doesn't necessarily need industrial scale enrichment right now. What the Iranians want is to have some sort of backup plan in case the Russians fail to provide Iran with the enriched uranium they need. And I think that perhaps a positive step could be for the P5+1, for the rest of the P5+1, to back this offer and say, if Russia fails to provide Iran with, so essentially, meets its end of the bargain, then the P5+1, the rest of them would step in. This would help Iran rely less on domestic enrichment and rely less on the narrative of the need of domestic enrichment as well, which is a very important reason why they can't really cut back to less than about 4,000 centrifuges right now, because this has become such a key issue in the discourse. Lastly, I want to talk about the challenges that I see going forward. In the next few months, there's going to be a lot of domestic challenges for both parties, actually, and I think Huzba will talk about that. But from a technical perspective, what could potentially derail the talks is Iran's R&D, research and development activities. Shortly before the November 24th deadline this year, Iran started feeding some of its IR-5 centrifuges with UF6. So this generated a lot of debates whether or not Iran was in violation of its interim deal obligations. And ultimately, so the two parties, I guess, in this debate were in the United States, ISIS, not the people in Iraq and Syria, but David Albright's ISIS in D.C., who raised the question following a report by the IAEA, and others who were saying, no, Iran is not isn't in complying with its obligations. Iran, of course, stepped in and said, no, we're not, violating the terms of the agreements, but then agreed to suspend this activity. So ideally, Iran, in the next 7 months, would avoid taking any measures that would undermine the interim deal. It would ideally refrain from R&D activities that could add fuel to the fire. But what the government of Iran will have to balance and will have to manage is the domestic push for more activities, and to be able to show that it is continuing its nuclear program, that the political and economic isolation that the people endured in the past 10, 12 years weren't for nothing, while at the same time complying with its interim deal agreements obligations, and to continue to build trust without undertaking any more sensitive activities. This will become increasingly an issue, I think, in the next few months as new generations of centrifuges become ready for the Iranians to use, including the IR-8s. So I think I've used up my 10 minutes, and I'll stop here.
Okay, you could have maybe had 30 more seconds, but that's good. You outlined a more positive possibilities than I had myself thought, that if Iran is already talking of 7,500 centrifuges, and you said they should be able to get down to 4,000 to 5,000, then that would be consistent with what the other powers in the talks have been insisting, although, as you said, it's tied to other issues, and those might be tricky, and we might talk about them in the next two presentations. Rusbeh, talk to us a bit about some of the domestic political environment situation.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Dina and Mark, to the Light of West. It's my pleasure to be here with you.
I think you turned it off.
I turned it off?
I think so. It's on now.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
I'll try and build on what Ariane was talking about, because obviously a lot of the domestic dynamics deal with this issue more than anything else. So we can basically say that there is your usual run-of-the-mill dynamic of enmity and undermining each other that we find in DC. We also find in Tehran between the executive and the legislative, where the parliament, which is dominated by conservatives, have been trying in all kinds of ways to needle the president without necessarily addressing the issue of the nuclear negotiations. Because on that one, consistently so far, the supreme leader has been backing the negotiation effort. Now, he has done it in his own, shall we say, somewhat peculiar way, of both supporting it and at the same time keeping a safe distance in case it would blow up, and also now and then coming up with red lines that they have to adhere to. Now, we can discuss how much of this is contradictory and helpful or not, but obviously what it does, and especially when the hardliners now and then do come up with criticism of the negotiation effort, they are trying to box in the negotiators in order to make sure they don't do anything that they would not stomach. The Rouhani administration has been quite good at fending this off, I think, if nothing else also by firstly keeping the content of the negotiations to themselves, and then inviting in people from parliament and elsewhere to kind of see what is necessary for them to see. And I think we can see that in the reactions in Tehran to the negotiations in the last couple of days, is that we have some sources that will always reliably criticize anything, and that would be, for instance, Kayhan's editor, Hossein Shariat Madari, but we see other sources of reliable conservative criticism who have been much more muted, and in fact partly also commended the negotiators on holding fast to what they consider to be the minimum requirements from the Iranian perspective. And this is also something that the president addressed himself when he pointed out that Iran has not given up its enrichment, and it is not expected to do so, and that the West, in that sense, the P5+1, have accepted that very basic demand from Iran. So this is not a negotiation about removing the Iranian enrichment program. This is a negotiation about the modalities and the format of that negotiation, of that enrichment. So in that sense, that's the way Rouhani is trying to sell it at home, that this is not a defeat, this is not a slippery slope towards defeat. It's obviously not an outright victory yet, but it is definitely in the right direction. Now, this, of course, points to another problem that both sides have, and that is that if they were to gloat about what they got and what they got away with at the negotiations, they're obviously making it much more difficult for their own partners on the other side of the table. So there is here an element of, shall we say, required modesty. To make sure that even though one did get something or did get away with something, you have to sell that in a mild-mannered way, otherwise the other side who signed will not be able probably to keep to their signature. So, and if politicians are able to stay away from the temptation of gloating, that is obviously an open question. Usually their track record isn't very impressive. So this is what deals with the nuclear negotiations as such. Obviously, other things are happening in Iran, since it's not just about nuclear stuff that things evolve and revolve in Tehran. The other aspects, of course, is the general, shall we say, relationship with the IRGC, with the Revolutionary Guards. Here, I think we see a bit of a paso doble, a dance going forward and backwards a bit, especially in the beginning of his administration. The President Rouhani was rather clear, in my opinion, on trying to keep the IRGC within the confines of what they were supposed to be doing, talking a lot about that the economy was a responsibility that they shouldn't shoulder alone, shall we say. And this is something that he has been working on a bit, and in the beginning they were agreeing to some degree, and at the same time we can also see that in this negotiation they're also getting certain parts recognized. These are very legitimate economic activities that they have. They sign contracts with the president almost as if they were two foreign entities signing a convention of some kind. So we can see there that he is both giving them and taking something from them, trying to come to some kind of modus vivendi. Now, he's obviously the best person suited for this, since his relationship with the Revolutionary Guards go back more than a decade. But at the same time, we can also here see that the Revolutionary Guards, being a conglomerate, both in a business term but also in an institutional term, has somewhat conflicting ideas about what it wants and what it cannot stomach. So on the one hand, it has economic interests that it wants to safeguard. On the other hand, it's also had a rather plush deal, and I think Ali might get into that later, through these sanctions, because it has undercut whatever foreign competition it could have had for major undertakings within the business world. So, and there are now and then leaks of different kinds of sessions where high-ranking commanders of the Revolutionary Guards have been talking about their own prowess, their power, what they think of the government, and so on. And it's always a bit difficult to figure out whether they're releasing these leaks themselves in order to show off, or whether it's being released by someone who wants to show how little they are in synchronization with the administration. I think it's a bit of both. But what it does point to is that there is a tension, and that tension is partly due to the immediate dynamics of the nuclear negotiations, but it is also structural. That is, regardless of the nuclear negotiations, this structural tension would be there, just in the same way that we can see that every executive administration in Iran has at some point had to have a very, very frank conversation of some kind with the supreme leader, because of the fact that their authorities overlap. And I think in this particular case we can see a clear sign where the supreme leader is trusting, perhaps is a word to go too far, but nonetheless hoping that he can, through compartmentalizing the international situation, allow this particular administration to solve this particular issue and leave everything else as it was. Now, whether this works in reality is a totally different issue. But I think what it does point to is that he wants the nuclear issue resolved, and he's willing to go quite far in backing the administration to get there. But whether he wants this opening to then, if you will, spread to other areas of contention is a different issue. Because I think there he will get into a different kind of resistance from other groups that so far he has been able to kind of keep in check. So for this issue, for the moment, all the ducks are in a row, and that seems to make it easier, in a sense, for Iran, once it decides to promise something, to actually fulfill it. Unlike, shall we say, the Obama administration, whose ability to get the ducks in a row is in question, not just in Tehran. I think I'll stop there.
Thank you, Rusbeh. You also painted a complex picture, but one that's a bit rosier than what I had myself thought. I see myself on a different side in some ways, not politically, but just assessing, and you've been closer to it. In your description of the Supreme Leader giving Rouhani enough leeway to try to strike a deal, I had been under the impression that he had set red lines you referred to in the beginning of your talk, which constrained the negotiators to the degree that they weren't able to strike a deal. But it sounds like you think maybe a deal is still within striking distance. Maybe we'll get into that in the discussions. But let's go now to Ali to talk about some of the economic and commercial aspects.
Lovely. Thank you very much as well for the invitation, and obviously two very tough acts to follow on this panel. I want you to start by imagining that you're on a ship sailing through pretty stormy waters. You're being battered by the winds, one of your main sails is just broken, you're beginning to take on water. And to make matters worse, you're being captained by an incompetent sailor called Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Now, this has been basically the picture of the Iranian economy for the better part of the past decade. But gradually now, there is some hope on the horizon. There's a better, skipper, if you may, in charge. He has a better crew. The storm has partly abated, but not completely. But of course, the dangers are far from over, as we'll discuss. I think since taking office, President Rouhani has had to deal with a number of challenges, both the effect of the sanctions, which of course we'll discuss in more detail. He's had to deal with the side effects of the global economic crisis, and of course the legacy left for him by his predecessor. I think it's important maybe to start our discussion by looking at the year 2012. This is the year before Rouhani took office. It was the year when Iran was facing a massive macroeconomic crisis. There was stagflation, caused in part, of course, by the sanctions, but also by loose monetary policies, by the subsidy reform payments, and of course by the fact that the government was just not managing the economy very well. So you had high inflation, high unemployment, and a budget deficit all at the same time. So take the boat analogy, you had a perfect storm basically brewing. And if you looked at most economic indicators during this year, they were actually quite grim. The economy as a whole had contracted by about 6%. GDP had basically contracted by about 6% compared to the year before. Inflation was at 41%. You had government commitments due to unfinished projects being at about $160 billion. That's the size of the Hungarian economy, to give you some context. And the subsidy payments which were being done in a direct way as part of the reforms were actually outstripping revenue by a factor of 1.4. So this was highly unsustainable. And perhaps more importantly, more than 1 in every 4 young person at that time was unemployed. Now, this crisis became the impetus for the reforms that are happening today. And the reforms are meant to focus on curbing inflation, managing employment in a better way, but also creating reforms that would increase trade. This is partly meant to happen through deregulation, a reform of the tax system, and an increase, for example, of the value-added tax, but also through better monetary discipline and privatization. Now, of course, this is not going to be easy. It's probably going to take until the end of the decade before it materializes in full. And it's, of course, compounded by the issues we just heard about right now, in terms of the comprehensive deal on the sanctions, but also the actual ability to implement some of these reforms given the domestic challenges that exist. So with that background, what is basically happening now? So the main focus right now is on discipline. The central bank, since August 2013, has been running a tight ship, excuse the analogy, and has focused very much on a tighter monetary policy. So they've managed to bring down inflation to an extent. So year-on-year inflation in November was 13.2%. The average assumption for the year, for the Iranian year, is that it will be about 23%, which compared to the previous year, which was 40%, is of course lower. But don't get me wrong, this is, 23% inflation is still very, very high. But the downward trend is, of course, what's interesting here. Central bank has also pledged to unify the official and the bureau exchange rate by the middle of next year. And this, as I'm sure most of you know, is a bit of a challenge, both for trade but also for a variety of other structural reasons. Now, where do we go from here? I think the story becomes very much one of ifs and buts. And there's a lot of ifs and buts. I'm going to take you through a few of them that we can hopefully then discuss later on. So I think that if sanctions are eased and if these reforms are implemented, you'll see an improvement of the fiscal outlook. So the IMF, for example, estimates that if both of these two things happen, the government will go into a budget surplus already in the next fiscal year, so 2015, 2016. If these things don't happen, however, you'll see an increase of the deficit from 2.1% of GDP, which it is now, to 3.7% of GDP by 2020, which is a big increase. Again, if sanctions are reduced and the planned reforms are implemented, GDP growth will reach 5.7% by 2019. And positive growth has already started now, but this is obviously at a much higher level. But if sanctions are not eased and if the reforms stall for some reason, you'll have relatively flat growth of about 2% leading up to 2019. Now, 2% growth is still growth, but it's very, very modest for an economy of this size, which is also emerging. And finally, if we look at inflation, if sanctions are reduced and if reforms are implemented, you'll see you'll see inflation coming down to about 6% by 2019, according to the IMF. And if they're not reduced and reforms not implemented, it'll hover at about 20% from now until then, which of course is not a very good scenario. We've also heard a lot about the oil price. Mark wanted us to have a quick look at that. So I'll open a bracket for that and we can discuss it in a bit more detail. But I think when we look at the oil price, and obviously there's been a lot of discussion about that this past week, you see that the impact of the oil price drop per se on this fiscal year will not necessarily be very massive, and on Iran specifically. And the reasons for that are a couple. One is that During the past 6 to 8 months, Iran has actually sold higher volumes than had initially been expected. It has also sold its oil for a slightly higher price than initially been assumed. And also one thing that I think a lot of people forget is that Iran also sells a lot of condensate. So you need to think about total liquid volumes that are being sold and not just the crude oil. So it sells about 300 to 400,000 barrels a day of condensate. So if the price consolidates, let's say around 80, which given what happened with OPEC yesterday is now probably less likely, but if we play with the assumption that it settles around 80, the short-term effects should be manageable for this year. And the shortfall that could happen in part in the budget can probably also be fixed through withdrawals from the National Development Fund. But let's make one thing very clear. This is only going to work in the short term. If the price continues to go down, or if it settles at, let's say, $60, things will potentially get a bit more severe. And it's important to discuss that reality going forward. In Iran right now, there's discussion to set the oil price in next year's budget at $75 a barrel, as opposed to 100, which is the case for this year. And obviously, if export quantities don't increase under a potential comprehensive deal, that immediately is a 25% reduction of income. But in a more general sense, looking forward, what will the signing of a deal or a comprehensive agreement entail for the economy and for business? And I think that beyond some of the predictions that the IMF had, which I just cited, I think most of this is just guesswork. And obviously, I don't have a crystal ball either, and as much as I'd love to sit here and speculate, I'll try not to. But I think if I was a betting man, I would say that it's relatively safe to assume that a comprehensive deal, and if the reforms obviously happen to the economy, would entail a pretty positive impact for the economy and for the people going forward. It would entail more international investments, it would increase the government's budgetary leeway, and it would, of course, increase the efficiency in that economy. And I think it's important to bear in mind that this is not a place that's starting from scratch. This isn't Burma or Zimbabwe. There's already a high level of industrial capacity in this country, specifically in automotives and petrochemicals, obviously a hydrocarbon sector that needs a lot of assistance. When it comes to metals production, for example, this is a country that produces 15% more steel than the United Kingdom, and the same amount as France. So it's not a place that's starting from scratch. And as you may recall, Goldman Sachs also placed Iran as part of the next 11 countries that would hopefully emerge after the BRICS already in 2007. But looking more specifically at what businesses might think about the deal, I think a good reference point is a recent survey that an international law firm called Clyde & Co did over the past few months. And they looked at businesses that had either been directly impacted, such as oil and gas and financials, and businesses that hadn't been impacted, such as hospitality, food and beverages, and so forth. And obviously, not surprisingly, what you saw is that a lot of businesses had been affected by this and cited high impacts. But what's perhaps more interesting is what businesses are looking at going forward. And about 40% of the businesses that were surveyed by Clyde & Co said that they were looking at potentially expanding into Iran. They were studying things, but they were waiting to see what would happen. But over a third of companies had said that they already have concrete high-priority plans for expansion. They have already done their groundwork. They've done the internal processes, and they're just waiting for the starting gun to go off before they run. So I think that given this desire by industry and the possible reforms, if sanctions are lifted, there's room for great optimism. But at the same time, a lot of structural challenges remain, unfortunately. The state is still far too involved in the economy. The labor legislation is still far too rigid. You have incredibly high energy consumption due to years of subsidies, and inefficiencies abound. Corruption is still a big problem in this economy, and it still ranks very low on the Ease of Doing Business Index. So it ranks number 130 out of 189 countries. So by no means an easy market to be playing with. But just coming back to the point made earlier and also alluded to by Ruzbe and Aryan, I think President Rouhani, while being more capable than his predecessor and having a better team in hand, also has to deal with a very sensitive political balance domestically. So he basically has to deal with the external arena and the nuclear issue while keeping Mr. Khamenei happy. He has to deal with the fallout of global economic realities, such as the oil price, while keeping the general public happy. But he also has to deal with the need to reform and liberalize the economy while keeping certain vested interests happy. And I think that while he's a capable skipper, he's not a miracle worker. And I think that's important to bear in mind as we continue the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ali. All three speakers have made very cogent presentations, keeping as we wish to 10 minutes so that we would have ample time for discussion and Q&A. Normally, we set these meetings at 1 hour because we realize people engaged in enterprises have only so long for lunch that they can take off. But we've extended it for 30 minutes because of the size of the panel and the nature of the discussion. We will go until 2 o'clock if there's continuing discussion until then. If you need or want to leave early, you won't be insulting us if you have to do that. I think I want to start off the questions, if I may, Ali, with you. The picture you painted of an Iranian economy at 2% growth, at inflation halved, suggests that it's not on its knees at all. The sanctions haven't brought Iran to its knees. Those in Washington and elsewhere who argue for additional sanctions suggest that bringing Iran to its knees through sanctions would give them incentives to accept the deal that Aryan started to kind of paint. Do you think that given the diversified nature of the economy in Iran today, that is a reasonable hypothesis?
It's $1 million question, in a sense, I guess. I think it's, again, it's important to look at the numbers and look at some of the realities of this economy. While there's, of course, a huge opportunity cost that has been imposed on this economy as a result of the sanction, whether it's nearing collapse or not, I think is a much more difficult question to answer. And I think it's a difficult question to answer because partly you can't find single factor analyses for these things. Is it the oil price that's going to do it? Is it inflation that's going to do it? Is it unemployment that's going to do it? It's going to be obviously a combination of these factors that play into each other. But I think the way the economy looks, if we look at the numbers, we see an economy that over the past decade has actually managed to reduce its dependence on oil and gas quite significantly. Oil and gas right now only accounts for about 10% of GDP and about 40% of the budget. Now, again, mismanagement is a major issue. The government is supposed to rely more and more on taxes, but its actual ability to collect taxes is still not as good as it should be. The government is also supposed to control a lot of its own spending, which it's not being able to, as I alluded to. So I think, judging whether a system like this is on the verge of collapse is, of course, incredibly difficult. I would think that based on the numbers that we can see, it's probably not very close to that edge.
Okay, thanks, Ali. I'll entertain questions, and I'll maybe pose some of my own here and there. In the third row, the young gentleman in the red tie. Fourth row. And then you're next to them.
Hi there, Timothy Stafford from RUSI. My question is similar to Mark's, but for Mr. Parsi, which is, if the US Congress, now under Republican control come January, goes ahead and passes some variant of Menendez-Kirk, what's the political reaction in Iran? How badly is Mr. Rouhani damaged by that?
Go ahead. Yes. Why don't you go ahead and answer? We'll answer one by one for a little while.
Is it on now? No. Is it on now?
Stop touching that.
Okay. Sorry. I think it would be damaging, but I think if such sanctions were passed, I think the greatest damage would actually be to the P5+1. Because I doubt very much that you would be able to keep that coalition together if new sanctions are introduced before there is any clear indication for why they are being introduced, other than that you want to sabotage the Obama presidency, which seems to be the Republicans' main objective, regardless of the issue. So I think in that sense, the fallout will be, go way beyond what happens in Tehran. It would obviously make it much easier for the hardliners in Iran to say that this was a doomed venture to begin with, because the Americans cannot be trusted. But I also think there's something else we have to remember when we're talking about increased sanctions, regarding what Mark was mentioning, is that what are the nature of these increased sanctions? I mean, some of the things that have come up on the table, whether as trial balloons or otherwise, are things that by international law will put you very close, if not on the wrong side, of a declaration of war. An embargo of harbors, for instance, is a classical case of casus belli. This is, it's not you can't fiddle around no matter how many lawyers you have. It's a clear indication of a case of war. So then you're not, when we're talking about increased sanctions, it sounds great, but you also have to think about what is there left to sanction. And how do you do that? And that comes with a cost, both politically, but also in terms of the fact that it has an ability to start balls rolling that you don't know where they're going to end up.
Norman Moss, right before. Wait for the microphone, and then you're next.
When you said the young gentleman in the red tie, I thought you meant me. One of the speakers has written apparently about the influence of religion on these talks and on the whole nuclear program. I wonder if you could share some of your thoughts on this with us.
Don't.
I think I turned it on.
There you go.
All right. All right. How much time do I have to talk about it?
Minute and a half.
This is my PhD,
2 minutes.
so I could go on about it. Well, essentially, the points that I've been focusing on is, first of all, the fatwa, the nuclear fatwa that the Supreme Leader has issued, prohibiting nuclear weapons in very vague terms, and which Iran has been putting forward during the negotiations, but also before that. In a way to make up for its lack of compliance on several issues, saying, we may not be in perfect compliance with our obligations under international law, but we have a fatwa that proves that our program is merely peaceful. On the other hand, what I think is interesting is the perception that Iran, because of its ideological direction it's taken in the past 35 years, is a government that is led by Shia ideology, that it is a suicidal government that is ready to do anything to facilitate the return of the 12th Imam. And I think that is also a very deeply it's a deep misperception that Iran has proved in the past 35 years to essentially pursue its interests. You and I may not agree with its interests or how it qualifies them. But that, for the most part, the ideology is more of a rhetorical question than it is a practical one. Here's the gist.
Can I just follow up on that? And I'll get to you in a minute. The activities that Iran is alleged to have carried out in weaponization-related experiments and work seem incompatible with a fatwa against nuclear weapons. Now, in your article, you noted that what exactly the verb is in the fatwa is a little bit unclear, whether it's use, development, storage, or so forth. Do you have an answer to that question about how those development activities, if they are correct, if the allegations are true, are at all compatible with a fatwa?
Sure. So initially when Iran brought up the issue of the fatwa, it was in around 2005, and it was in a communication to the IAEA. And the precise wording that they used was the Supreme Leader has issued a fatwa saying that the production, stockpiling, and use of nuclear weapons are prohibited under Islamic law. The Supreme Leader has made a number of speeches since, and the only thing that he has said is that the use of these weapons is prohibited. So it depends which one of these statements you take into account. I think that the use part is a lot clearer than the production part. And yeah, I think that it is at this point undisputed that Iran has had weapon ambitions, or had weapons ambitions until 2003 anyway, that we know. So it contradicts the first statement that it gave to the IAEA, but it doesn't necessarily contradict what the Supreme Leader has said since.
Thank you. That clarifies something that I've been wondering about for a long time. Sir, and then Dina.
Thank you, Juban Godarzi, IISS member from Webster University, Geneva. My question is not addressed to any specific member of the panel. I just wanted to throw two quick observations at you and see what you have to say. It's kind of more of a down-to-earth question, because we're talking about governments and people, but not really about the people in Iran, in the sense that based on my visits to Iran, my two observations have been: one, Iranians, of course, are a proud people, the nuclear dispute is an issue for them, but it's not the priority issue in terms of people are more worried about day-to-day issues, economic survival, and all that. So that's my first observation. And the second observation is, I think the government since 2009 in terms of what happened in disputed presidential elections and the repression has lost a lot of its credibility and legitimacy in the eyes of the people. At the same time, I think because of what's happened since then and the sanctions, the power dynamic between the people and civil society groups and the population has changed in the sense that more power is now concentrated in the hands of the regime. The sanctions have hurt the regime, but I would argue that it's hurt the population and the independent bourgeoisie more. So in a sense, you have a situation where the government has less credibility, but in a way it's in a more powerful position vis-a-vis the people. So I just wanted to know any observations or feedback.
I wonder if
Thank you.
Rusbe, if you wanted to comment on that those observations.
Absolutely. I think I would agree with you that after 2009, you have a state where basically a lot of issues have become securitized, which is nothing, we see that in other societies too, but basically what it means is that the security apparatus has an ever-increasing field of, if you will, purview in terms of what it can discuss, what it can veto, etc., etc. So that's one aspect. And that has to do with the internal dynamics of the elections and the fallout from those elections. But the other aspect, of course, is that sanctions, no matter how much people want to maybe perhaps embellish them as being smart or not or whatever, is that these kind of sanctions that you level against the country tend to hit everyone to the same extent. It's just some people have more of a helmet and padding than others. And usually it's the state who manages to get away with most when they're sanctioned like this, while civil society and society at large does not. So you have two different reasons why the state has become more, if you will, powerful vis-a-vis its own society. One being this internal, because of the elections, and the other one because this increased external pressure, pressuring everyone more or less perhaps to the same degree, squeezes the society most, and economically speaking, and Ali would be able to tell this better than I can, obviously the middle class. Now the middle class, in my opinion, is never as big as people think, whether you're talking about the US or Iran or any country, but they have been an important factor in the political development. They kind of always punch above their weight in politics compared to what their demographic, etc., etc. And that middle class has been shrinking because of the way the economy has been handled.
Yeah, maybe you both want
I think I'll
Ali
just
and then
add to that.
Ariane.
Absolutely. I think your question is a very potent one. I think when you look at the actual on the ground impact of this process over the past few years, it hasn't been the 1% who have suffered. It's been the 99% to use that analogy. And whether it's with regards to medicines, or whether it's with regard to the price of food products, or with regards to the need to reform the subsidy system in order for the government actually to not have a higher deficit, and how that hits both the middle class that Rusba is mentioning, but also obviously some of the lower tiers of lower income tiers, and it's been by many respects disastrous. In terms of its effect on people. And it becomes very difficult to, when you're in Tehran, obviously, to talk about metrics and, but inflation is only 13% now, and, growth is going to be 2.3, so this is fantastic from a fiscal point of view. Whereas, obviously, people are looking at their pocketbooks, and they're looking at the fact that they can't, buy meat or fruit or whatever it may be. So I think it's definitely important to take that perspective into account. And also look at some of the distortions that this process has created, which will take years, I think, to unravel. So if you look at the mechanisms that have been created, either officially or semi-officially or unofficially, around how to go around these sanctions, and the price distortions that has created, which are not actually a reflection of the real cost of what it costs to get around these sanctions. I mean, I've heard estimates that it costs maybe 3 to 5% to go around the sanctions, but the real effect has been in the 50-60% area, roughly speaking. So obviously for the man on the ground, the average Ali, if you may, this is much more painful than for the 1%, definitely.
Ariane?
Yeah, just a quick point about the first issue you brought up. I think it's important to distinguish between the nuclear program per se and the talks. I think that most people in Iran support the talks and want the talks to succeed and go somewhere, because it is, having a big impact on their lives. But in terms of the nuclear program, I think it's a bit more complicated. I'm not sure that most, I don't know if there are concrete numbers, if there are polls about this, which I think there are, but a lot of people don't care whether or not Iran has enrichments, what size the enrichment program is. What they do care about is that this issue is solved and they can move on with their lives.
Thank you. I'd like to call on Dina Esfandiari, and in doing so, say that by rights she should be up here chairing this session, but she organized the whole thing, but I pulled rank.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark. Two questions. One to Ali. Something that I've heard a lot of people have told me recently is if there is no deal and the Iranian economy goes the way it continues to, Iran is going to find itself in a situation where increasingly it's not going to be able to buy staple goods like wheat. And so in the medium to long term, we're talking about a situation where we might end up facing bread riots in Iran. How likely do you think that is? And Ruzbe, one of the things that everybody often says is that the supreme leader, while supportive of the talks, is still sitting on the fence about what he thinks about the result of the talks. He's going to wait and see, or at least my view is that he's going to wait and see what the negotiators come back home with, and then make a call about whether he supports this final agreement or not. Again, would you agree with that?
Oh, you want to
start? Yeah. Bread riots. Okay. I'm not necessarily going to speculate about when or if that's going to happen per se, but I think the way we can maybe look at it is, what has the government been doing in terms of a plan B for if this thing fails? Now, there's been some reports, obviously, about increasing discussions with Russia and China and the usual kind of suspects for a plan B. But I think also part of the process over the past few years, which has been labeled this resistance economy, which if you look at it in detail, it's actually not aimed solely at the sanctions. This is actually a part revival of the 20-year development perspective, which was designed already in the early 2000s, is to create a better kind of prioritization in the economy where you would be able to handle some of these potential shocks going forward. So it's not only about sanctions, it's actually about a broader reform of the economy. Now, whether they won't be able to buy staple goods will very much obviously depend on partly the transactional sanctions, which are going to be the main problem, because the wheat in and by itself is not sanctioned. Is the problem is whether you can pay for it or not, and also how the government then prioritizes other types of spending. And this is one of the challenges I think going forward, is that obviously if the sanctions are not lifted and there is a plan B scenario, the government will have to hard prioritize, and will obviously choose to prioritize presumably things like wheat and other staple goods to the expense of other things which will in the long term harm the economy as well. So do I think there'll be bread riots? I don't know. Potentially, hopefully not, but I think government will prioritize and kind of implement a plan B to avoid social unrest. But that comes obviously at a huge opportunity cost for the rest of the economy and for industry and for various other sectors. I think one interesting example also to maybe look at as a possible kind of signpost is around payments in the petroleum sector. And there might be colleagues here obviously who know about this better than I do, where there was a point where Shell actually owed a lot of money to Iran, and they wanted to carry out these payments through wheat, which was going to be transferred from the US. But they were actually stopped in doing this because it was ultimately linked to the petroleum sector. So the challenge is, regardless of how creative you get in this process, there will always be someone who pulls some sort of legal thing against you and stops your ability to do it. So I think it's potentially very challenging going forward. That's a summary.
Thanks. Ruzbe.
Okay, very quickly, but first I want to actually address something else, if I may. As an historian, I'm a bit suspicious when people talk about collapse. When people talk about the sacking of Rome, they think it went from Caesar to something that suddenly just ended. Most states muddle through and are degraded. They don't collapse. If you look at Iraq during the sanctions, the reason why it collapsed was because of the American invasion. Otherwise, it would have kept going on for at least a little while longer. So societies, in a sense, are a bit like human beings starving. Different things, you stop doing them to the same degree, you stop eating as much because there isn't anything to eat, and then at some point your life-sustaining systems collapse. But it doesn't happen overnight in any way. And I think in the Iranian case, it's far off in that sense. Now, regarding Dina's question, I think the Supreme Leader's support is qualified, in that, of course, he can basically disown the whole process if it turns out to go very, very wrongly from his perspective. And I think perhaps just like every other party in this game, both in Iran and in the P5+1, he's also partly captive to his own rhetoric. If he makes too many statements, and he's done a few of them, coming up with very detailed ideas about what you can and you cannot do, then of course he will have to backtrack from those himself at some point. But I think also he has another card up his sleeve, if you will, and that is that if, and this is my speculation, if the negotiations come to a conclusion that can be positive, but will require, inevitably, painful concessions from Iran, and he's confronted with whether he can stomach them or not, he has support from the population, which is what Ariane was referring to. I think if you look at the way Iranians were following the negotiations, for them it was bigger than the World Cup in football, which is big in Iran. Yeah? So, I mean, everyone was really waiting and speculating about whether there would be a last-minute signature on a piece of paper that would say, okay, now we're in a different world. So if he ends up in a situation where there are power circles in Tehran who still want to hold out, and he would think that no, whatever Rouhani administration came up with could work, he can always appeal to the population. I think he would have the majority with him.
Rusbeh, you just contradicted Jublin, who said for the Iranians, nuclear issue isn't the top priority, but if it beats the World Cup, I think it... Ariane, you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one element to Rusbeh's response, that the negotiating team also has people who are very close to the Supreme Leader. Araqchi is very close to the Supreme Leader, to the Supreme Leader's circle anyway, and I honestly doubt that the negotiators would go back home with a deal that the Supreme Leader would, that would take him by surprise, that he wouldn't sign off to. So.
Okay. Desmond Bone in the fifth row on the side. Go up the side.
Thanks very much, Desmond Bone. I'm a IISS member. I just like to continue to focus on the political side for a moment. I mean, it's said that the Supreme Leader is old and, who knows, might need to be replaced at some stage. What does that mean in terms of continuity, or what risks arise out of that? And I suppose with that goes the kind of role of the IRGC, and I guess they've got preoccupations elsewhere now. Whether their kind of roles in propping up Iraq and taking on ISIS, I mean, whether that actually means they've got other things to do rather than think about the sort of their domestic constituency. I mean, how does that fit together? And sort of final point really is, I mean, to what extent is this a technical negotiation, or what is it? Is it really a grand bargain in disguise? And I mean, the extent to which there is this notion of a grand bargain, which people speak about in the newspapers but never quite define. I mean, is that ultimately what this is about?
I guess that's yours, Rusbeh.
I think it's important to go back to something that Ariane said. We are dealing with a state, this is my opinion, we're dealing with a state that is ruling over a post-revolutionary society, and whose elite to some degree is also post-revolutionary. Now, they can reach that point voluntarily, or, if you will, very reluctantly, but nonetheless. So I think it's important to also remember that here we have issues that are of national security, national interest, which I would wager you would be the same even if you had a Shah or someone else running the country. So Iraq is, for instance, one of them. Iraq is not an issue where one party, I think, they would go about it differently maybe, but it would be a top priority regardless of who is running Tehran, because of the history they have with Iraq. Okay? So I think there I would see clear continuity. It's about geopolitics. It doesn't really matter who is running the place. Now, they could go about it in more or less professional ways and more or less rhetorically belligerently, sure, but nonetheless, it's an important issue. Regarding the Supreme Leader, everyone is speculating if he were to die, because this is like the Pope in that sense. We've only had 2 so far, and none of them have resigned voluntarily. So that's the track record we have. So whoever comes instead will really be in a pickle. And I think that is partly because of the fallout of the 2009 election. Now, there's been some repair on that, but nonetheless, that is an issue. Because you see, the thing here is that if the Supreme Leader, his position, becomes very, very powerful, and whoever has that office gets to rule and run everything, then it becomes a 0 or 1. It becomes a zero-sum game, so that anyone who is not in the camp of the next supreme leader will then feel existentially threatened. Right? So as long as the system has allowed the kind of cohabitation without it being necessarily institutional. No, I mean, in the US, for instance, if you run out of office because of an election, you go to a think tank and you sit there and you harp about things for a couple of years, and then your next guy comes in, and then you end up in an executive office again. In Iran, you have something similar, but it's not as well elaborated. Now, if the Supreme Leader's office were to continue the way it did after 2009, collecting powers, if you will, and becoming even more central to how things were run, then that makes the election of the next one more tricky. Because the grip on power would be tighter, but it would also be more brittle. Because then you will end up with people within the system who are almost literally fearing for their lives. I think what's happened since 2013 and what came up to 2013 is basically trying to relax that a bit. But if you compare the office of the Supreme Leader today to 10 years ago or 15 years ago, I would say it's much bigger just in terms of numbers of people there. And it's much more important for trying to get things done. And that's a history that the Islamic Republic has had from the beginning, which is that institutions get into a kind of lockdown with each other, and then they have to create a new institution to deal and mediate with the problem between the two previous institutions. And now the mother of all institutions is the Beit al-Ahbar, the office of the leader, who basically now has to try and reconcile everything that's happening all over the place, particularly in Parliament. So if you go back in the last 7-8 years, you see that a lot of the time when things go bad in Parliament and everything just gets stuck, everyone turns to the Supreme Leader's office in the hope that he will mediate. And he will tell them, calm down, get your work done. They will be quiet for 7 days, then we'll start bickering again and go back to him. And that's a situation that's it's not tenable in the long run, so they have to do something about it. So I think the next Supreme Leader, it's going to be a very tricky affair, whoever is going to get elected.
Thanks, Rusbeh. When you say that there are issues that are of national importance, regardless of who is in charge, I mean, that's hard to dispute. I wanted to just go back to something you said earlier and offer a contrary point to something you had remarked upon in the American political system. You characterized Republicans as doing things simply to bring down Obama. Maybe you didn't use the word simply, but I think similarly, if I may say, those who seek additional sanctions also have a national interest perspective. What they differ on is whether those additional sanctions would actually be beneficial or counterproductive to achieving the stated objective. And of course, they may also have political objectives, but I felt we couldn't have a panel that simply agreed on everything, so I had to challenge at one point. The next, Lukasz in the fourth row. Lukasz Kuleza.
Thank you very much. A question again, I think to all the panelists. Assuming that we have the deal as by the next deadline and it's implemented in good faith by everybody, would it change significantly or to some extent, to any extent, the internal power relationship inside Iran? Could it be a beginning of the transformation of the nature of the regime, or would we just see more of the same? It means everybody would claim the victory is theirs, the Revolutionary Guard would gain their parts, the government would get their part of the cream, and nothing much changes. Thank you very much.
Who wants to take that one?
I think this is for the big guy.
He gets all of them.
Ariane, go.
Ariane, why don't you offer a perspective?
I think that in the immediate following of a comprehensive deal, what we would see is a pushback from the hardliners. They will try to come back and take the stage a bit more, and they will push back on several issues, including human rights. I'm stepping into Rusbeh's territory here, but I think that following that, after a few months, it will lead to the moderates and the reformists becoming a lot more empowered and being able to get on with other parts of the agenda that Rouhani had presented that weren't directly linked to the nuclear issue. It's important to remember that, for the past he's been in power for a year and a half now, almost 2 years. everything has been focused around the nuclear issue. There's been a lot of pushback on the human rights front. He hasn't been able to do much, but I think that after a comprehensive deal, after a few months, he would be able to do a lot more on that front.
No, I totally agree. I think it's important to think of this in terms of limited political capital. And so far it seems the calculation is to spend it on this issue because it can help the economy. And if it helps the economy, it fulfills the primary electoral promise he made. And that can then generate new political capital. And the hope would then be the assumption that he would then use it to deal with the other issues. Now, we also have to differentiate between what people think is going to happen when the deal comes and what will actually happen. So it could very well be that some of them are hoping that things will just stay the same, but they will have this particular issue solved. And I think that goes back to your question that I didn't quite answer, which is the grand bargain idea. My take would be that for some people in power circles, perhaps the Supreme Leader himself, I don't know, this is a question of compartmentalization. This is a question of solving this particular issue and, in my opinion, moving the Iranian-American relationship from a dysfunctional non-relationship to a functional non-relationship. Okay? So you still get to scream death to America, etc. Everything stays the same, the revolutionary ethos, blah, blah, blah. But we have solved this issue that makes so many other things more complicated than they have to be. I would say that other people are thinking that once that door is open, and they think this with hope or fear, you're basically on a slippery slope where the functional non-relationship will end up being a functional relationship. And I think perhaps that is the process of a grand bargain rather than that let's just sit down and solve everything together. Because because then you're going to have to bring in so many stakeholders from within the domestic scene of both Tehran and DC. I don't really see how any one of them can do that chess game in one session.
Functional non-relationship. I'll bet 2 people have just tweeted that. Have you got a copyright on it? We're going to start going to 2 people at a time here. Lily, bring it over to Nazanin Ansari and then Saeed Barzin over here. Oh, no, sorry. No, Nazanin on the 3rd row. You're coming up.
Hello, good afternoon. Nazanin Ansari. You mentioned a similarity between America and Iran as far as politics is concerned, but I don't think there is like a candidate in jail like Mr. Mousavi, or Mr. Khatami doesn't have a passport to even travel, or Mr. Ahmadinejad even can't travel. Apart from that, yes, there is this fight between Mr. Rouhani, this battle, if you would like, between Mr. Rouhani and the parliament, but it's not only with the legislative, but it's also with the judiciary, and it is also with hardline elements in the IRGC. It is also with other more extreme elements right of the IRGC. So, and considering that what Mr. Saeed Leila said about the economic woes of Iran, that it is not blaming only Ahmadinejad, but also over 30 years of mismanagement, of lack of transparency, accountability, responsibility, that basically 80%, there are people who are talking about 80% of the Iranian economy being in the hands of the bunyads and the IRGC, including the distribution networks, including the transportation networks, including the telecommunications networks. What do you think, and this is a question to all of you, is how do you think that after the deal has been made, suddenly those who are benefiting from the sanctions, such as the IRGC and the hardline elements, why would they suddenly give up all this control? And to Aryan, we have heard consistently about this fatwa through conversations, discussions, this speech, that speech. Why doesn't the Supreme Leader just put it on paper? Or if it's on paper, have you seen it? Thank you.
You pass the mic right in front of you. Hold on to that, and then next question will. Yes. Saeed? Yes, please.
I'm going to reformat the issue which was raised regarding the grand bargain. Have you seen any indications, any signs that political issues outside the nuclear technicalities, political issues have been discussed by the 2 sides, and have these issues been making the process more difficult? That's my first question. The second question, regarding the position taken by hardliner, would you not agree that part of the reason for such posturing is the need for a fallback position? They need to have a fallback position in a situation where the talks fail, as they did 10 years ago, where they can go back to their people and say, well, as we told you, we were not optimistic, and the United States can never be trusted for a deal. So do you agree that a fallback position is partially responsible for the position taken by hardliners, including the Supreme Leader? Thank you.
Okay, so we have 4 questions here, and I think there's probably one that appeals to each of you, but take whichever ones you want. You want to go first, Ali?
Sure, absolutely. I think even though I tried to kind of highlight through the use of statistics that there's possibly room for hope, deep down inside I'm actually a worst case scenario thinker. And you know, my friends here know this, I tend to kind of, doom is a big thing for me because I like to plan for risks way ahead of time. But when it comes to the economy and the opening up of this, I think, and as I touched upon in my introduction as well, there are huge distortions in this economy which will make things quite difficult going forward, even if the sanctions are lifted, even if reforms are implemented. So it's by no means going to be a situation where, you know, in June there's a deal, the doors open, and all of a sudden it's Switzerland. And I think it would be naive to kind of think that or assume that, even based on some of the more positive statistics that we're seeing coming out of the economy. At the same time, I think it's important to look at, and you know, I kind of singled out Ahmadinejad a little bit because I think while there has been a significant degree of challenges and mismanagement in this economy for the past 30 years, those 8 years were just something completely different. If you look at the period of President Rafsanjani, inflation was a lot higher at that time than it actually was during the time of Ahmadinejad. It reached 55% at that time, so it was much higher. But there were also structural reasons for that. This was a time when the government was spending a lot of money on reconstruction and so forth, and the economy was being gradually liberalized. But having said that, I think the challenges of this economy are not going to get solved simply because there is a deal in June or in March. There will be distortions. There are vested interests that need to be addressed, and I touched upon that as well. And it will not be either a free-for-all in which everybody kind of gets to do whatever they want, but it would also not necessarily be a situation where businesses are able to fully function in a fully transparent and fully competitive environment. I think the challenges will still be there. The ease of doing business ranking is a very good metric for seeing where a country lies in terms of its ability to allow business to basically operate. And I think you'll see in a lot of the large industries many challenges going forward for the next decade.
Good. I just realizing we got more people that want to ask questions, so we'll go for crisp answers and crisp questions. Anybody else want to take Ruzbe, please?
Well, yes, regarding the comparison, obviously no comparison is complete. It wasn't meant to be one. But I think if you look at the way, as I said, the structural tension between the executive and all other institutions have been there from the beginning, basically almost regardless of who is running which, since they're all trying to balance each other out. And I think in that you can also compare it to the United States system in that presidents come in and they have a lot of enthusiasm. They might have won a landslide victory, etc., etc. You have inertia in all systems. In the Iranian case, the inertia is partly institutional rather than bureaucratic, if we can make that differentiation. And that institutional inertia is then used by those who are not in that office to try and stop things. That being said, I think, to kind of connect it to the other question, will things get better if there is a deal? Absolutely, for a very simple reason. This is a sophisticated economy and a sophisticated society with a lot of dynamic built into it that basically needs to be released. And it's not starting from scratch, as Ali mentioned. And in any case, if there is a deal and anything happens towards opening, which I think is inevitable with that deal, that is in any case going to be better than what was before. So it's not a question of saying, as Ali was saying, this is not a question of projecting Switzerland, but this is a country that has a lot of potential, and if that is released, it will be definitely better than what was.
Can I just have one key point to kind of just in support of that? Because I think there's a lot of actually analysis, scientifically kind of done analysis around history, which shows that countries that actually have a huge amount of economic engagement and higher foreign investment actually end up becoming better politically and socially. So I think some of these issues, hopefully, will also be better resolved when there is a greater degree of economic interaction. As long as this country is isolated, a lot of these problems are just going to get worse.
Ariane?
Yeah, I'm just going to pick up on this and then go back to the fatwa question. Another key issue is that in the past few years, the Iranian civil society has been paralyzed in many ways. Every time people wanted to do something to push for reforms, there was this whole idea that there's a threat of a war with Israel. If you take steps, then that would encourage the U.S. and Israel to take action against Iran. So I think that if there is a deal, then that would also help the civil society step up a little bit. On the fatwa question, that's the $1 million question as well. The important thing is that in Shia jurisprudence, you don't need to write a fatwa as long as there are witnesses, and there's specific requirements for a fatwa to be acknowledged. But if you're saying that this is the key documents that sort of dictates your nuclear policy, then yeah, it should be on the website, and it's not, as far as I know. The last I checked, it wasn't there. So
make a nice infographic about it.
They should make that.
Yeah. Let's bring the mic down to the front here. I'm going to take 3 people now, starting with Brahim, then you, sir.
Thank you very much, Brahim. Mohammed Shakir, Statoil.
Oh, no.
A crisp question directly to Ali. Ali, the oil price.
Yes.
God forbid the oil price falls anymore. After what happened to OPEC yesterday, and things that you yourself elaborated, if the oil price does keep falling, does that incentivize the Iranians to cut a deal? I'll leave it as simple as that.
Yeah.
Okay, let's pass the mic here, please.
Sina Batalabi, master student at SOAS. Looking at the broader region, in the event of a comprehensive deal, how is Iran going to sell the deal to Saudi Arabia? Because of course, the United States has consulted with Saudi Arabia as well as Israel, and the US and Iran will have to go back to their domestic constituents to sell the deal. But what about Saudi Arabia?
Okay, and pass the mic right in back here to the second row.
Thank you. Brahim from Statoil UK. My question is, will potential cooperation between the American and Iranian on containing ISIS, like suggested by Obama, and also cooperation on the Syrian conflict, will ease tensions between the two camps and shorten the time for reaching an agreement on the sanction, on the nuclear program?
Ali, why don't you go first?
Being ganged up on by my former colleagues at Statoil, that's always good fun. I think on the oil price, I'm reluctant to kind of do single factor analysis for the simple reason that we don't know where the oil price is heading, even though there are indications that it might be going further down. And also, I think Iran's calculation has for some time been that it might actually go lower, because this, while some in the media are treating this as a massive surprise that it's going to this level, this didn't come as a shock in terms of simple kind of supply and demand dynamics earlier on in the summer. So I think there has been a degree of thinking around, well, what if it goes down to 60? What if it goes down to 75 or whatever? It will definitely be yet another layer of issues to consider in these conversations, but I don't think it will be the one thing that will push Iran towards making a deal. Because in addition, if it makes a deal and pumps more oil, the price will potentially also go down. So there's a weird, complex dynamic there. So.
And maybe I'll take the one about Saudi Arabia, if I may, which is a foreign relations question. I think it's probably not Iran that's going to sell it to Saudi Arabia. It's going to be the United Kingdom and United States, and they're not going to be able to sell it successfully because the Saudis think that any enrichment program gives a path forward. But to the extent that I think the fact that there wasn't a deal on the 24th of November shows that the negotiators are not going to make a deal just for the sake of making a deal, and hopefully that will resonate in Riyadh. Gentleman in the blue sweater in the back, and then Matt Cutty, 1 row or 2 rows ahead of him.
We didn't answer the ISIS question.
Oh,
ISIS question.
ISIS question. Oh, sorry. We'll do that later. Okay. Go.
Thank you. So thank you. It's been a really interesting discussion. Wondering what Washington's Just wondering what Washington's aiming at. Is it to do with the substance of the deal on nuclear enrichment, or is Washington, or elements in Washington aiming at regime change? Just thinking about the example of Iraq, sanctions and WMD there. And then maybe also the Brookings Institute, Which Path to Persia report as well. Thank you.
And pass the microphone to Matt Cutty, please.
Thanks, Matt Cotty. I work here at the Institute. A very quick, potentially basic question to Ali. How easy is it to actually remove sanctions? And to what extent is this process and the timeframes involved actually understood within Iran, both within the government but also publicly as well?
Which sanctions, though?
Sanctions broadly defined. You can choose any that you prefer.
Okay.
the quickest to answer.
Thanks. Before we go back to the panel, let me just elaborate on the ISIS question, which we've neglected. There's a kind of a strange dynamic that Iran has been saying to the United States that you should strike a better deal on the nuclear issue in order for us to be able to help you with your problem with ISIS. Whereas, I mean, the problem with ISIS is, to me, it's Iran's problem. They're right next door. America's problem is secondarily. Rusby, if you have any thoughts on that, and then if you want to address the regime change motivation issue.
Very quickly, just to latch on to something that Mark was saying before. Iran cannot sell a deal to Saudi Arabia, but obviously Iran can do things or refrain from doing things that could make it worse. So that there is a question of, coordination, if you will. Regarding ISIS, the Iranians do, yes, rhetorically claim that somehow ISIS is an American problem. But I think through their actions, and if you look closely at what they're doing, it's very clear that obviously it's a huge problem for Iran as well. I don't think that they were clear on just how bad things were in Iraq, so they scrambled like everyone else. But I think in this case, it's both's problem. I mean, both of them have a serious problem with ISIS. I can't really think of anyone who doesn't have a problem with ISIS. But in terms of the two single most important countries from the outside who can affect the situation in Iraq, I would say it is, yes, the United States and Iran. In terms of the tactical military needs. But in terms of a political solution, which is the only thing that's going to last, you're going to have to need to get the other Arab neighbors involved. So that this does not become basically just another zero-sum game where everyone is using the Iraqis as proxies for something else. Regarding regime change in the US, I think like many others, had my disappointments with the Obama administration, but I seriously doubt that anyone in that administration is thinking of regime change. I think you will find more of that in Congress. I know I'm badgering Congress a lot, but I think they deserve it, so that's fine. I think that's where you find the people who basically can't be bothered with looking at Iran for real, and instead, indulge in these kind of games where they think they can manipulate things to go in a certain direction. And I think they are grossly misjudging the situation. That, just very quickly, brings me back to the idea of the oil price being used as a lever on Iran. I don't think that's going to work. Sincerely, I really, really hope that everyone in this process realize that for the next 7 months, they have to really get this done, instead of continuing playing like little kids in a sandbox, thinking they can find new ways of pinching the other one without anyone noticing, because that's not going to work. And by the end of these 7 months, I don't see how any one of them could, with a straight face, claim that they need yet another 6 months. So, this is it.
Ali, sanctions.
Sanctions. Well, I'll pick the ones that I think were going to be the most problematic, and that's the U.S. sanctions. For the simple reason that, not because of the kind of the legislative process necessarily only, but because when you look at it from an industry or business perspective, the EU and the UN sanctions, despite being quite tough, are actually relatively easy to understand. And also the process for which they are to be removed and implemented are relatively, I think, easy to understand from a business perspective. The US side, while again, you can read the legislation, you can understand it, there are question marks around, will they be waived, will they be actually lifted, how will the mechanism for, taking the pressure off work? And that is a massive question mark, at least from a business perspective, as to, whether you be hit by that stick or not, if there's a waiver, if the waiver is then, again, not extended by the next president and so forth. So I think, I'm not an expert on sanctions, I'm not a legal expert in any sense, but I would think that from a business perspective, the US ones are the most problematic and difficult to kind of deal with.
We're running very late. I'm going to just call on the last question. Is it Mahmoud in the back here? Yeah.
My question is more towards the worst case scenario. Everyone speaks about the number of centrifuges, but not about the capacity of those centrifuges. Sometimes we hear it in the media. So what if Tehran goes and advances its centrifuges to the next generations and able to shrink that breakout time during that period of the negotiations, and thus being able to minimize the learning curve for their R&D scientists, and then not reach an agreement, making it more probable for a sneak out scenario to become. And the second part of the question is what the other countries in the region would have to do to counter such a scenario.
Ariane, I'm glad you got a good question at the end here.
I mean, the number in the end is going to be decided in separative work units as opposed to centrifuges. So how much the output of the centrifuges. Currently, the reason why people are focusing on the number of centrifuges is that Iran's operating centrifuges are IR1s. They're all the same sort of generation. And under the JPOA, Iran is not really supposed to start enriching with other centrifuges. So in the next 7 months, if Iran is in compliance with its JPOA agreements, obligations, then that issue shouldn't become a major sticking point. But the number that they will agree to in the end will be in SWU, in separative work units, which will cover all generations of centrifuges.
Okay, crisp answer. Good. I want to thank the panelists who have been, I think, marvelous in addressing, each from their respective areas of expertise, a range of issues on this subject. And it's a subject that isn't going away quickly. I think we'll come back maybe in 7 months and see if Reza's right, or if I'm right, that we'll have another extension in 7 months. Please join me in thanking the panelists and thanking Dina for setting it up.